Sometimes I get all kind of confused as to what I think you need to hear the most. And as you can see, I've got all this paper here. I think we're going to talk about, let's go over this one. My name is Pandy Pridemore. I'm coming to you from the ICRC-TV station in Cincinnati, Ohio. When we started the show years ago, we decided we had to provide you with information that you could apply, information that would help you with your success and what you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes it really comes down to just sometimes the basics. We just need to be refreshed on the basics. An individual called me from Utah the other day, and I was so flattered. She's thinking about becoming a consultant, and she wanted, some ideas and such. And after we hung up, I thought, wow, I hope somebody's working with her to make sure that her skills are polished and that she hasn't become complacent. 10, 15 years in HR, but mainly with just 2 or 3 employers over that period of time. Sometimes we get in a rut and we forget that things are changing and we have to stay compliant, even in the simplest of things. And so I kind of wanted to go over the personnel files today. And I know you're going to go, oh, I know what I'm doing. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But more and more, especially with the retention of employees becoming shorter and shorter. It used to be that we'd have a personnel file and that individual would have been with the company for 10, 15 years. Now I'm seeing people with retention averaging maybe 2 years. People are literally rolling out of the doors. And with that is the rise of online HRIS systems, mainly through the payroll companies, who are gathering supposedly all this information electronically. And once it goes in there, the HR person never sees it again. They're not paying attention. And so I want to go over some of the guidelines to make absolutely sure that you're not using those HRIS systems as just a dump all, number one. Number two, that you are following a few other little points to keep things compliant when it comes to personal information on your employees. Now, everyone knows those need to be secured. And when I say secured, I mean the only people that should have the right to see a personnel file outside of the employee are those who have a need to know. Now, sometimes I walk in and it's, we just put it online. I've got it in the payroll system. And I say, but who has access to the payroll system? Oh, well, the directors do, the managers do, the payroll processor. So, wow. So any of those individuals can go in to the payroll system and they can just kind of look through to see not only what somebody's making, but they can see any performance evaluations, corrective actions, garnishments, drug tests. So my point I'm trying to make is you need to make absolutely sure that information that's being kept electronically is secure. It's easier when we had the paper files and we could put them in a locked filing cabinet and only 2 people had the key. So what are you doing? What is your common practice, your current standards, and who's establishing those? Second of all, I want to talk about what goes in a personnel file. Because what I'm finding now is that very few people are taking applications. They're only taking resumes. And are you downloading those into your electronic file if you're not keeping a paper copy? How about the offer letter or the employment agreement if you're going to use one of those? make sure, because that's not in your payroll system, that's going to be prior to. So are you taking that signed offer letter and downloading that into the HRIS system? Or is your manager still holding that at their desk? Is the hiring authority holding on to that at their place of their office or their cubicle? All this should be consolidated because it's personal information. How about handbook acknowledgments, policy acknowledgments, evaluations, performance evaluations, corrective actions? How about promotional and transfer information, work history? Keeping that in one consolidated place is highly advisable. And if you're making a transfer, are you documenting that so that it can be kept memorialized in a personnel file? If you're promoting somebody, are you giving the reason, memorializing it? So that if it's challenged, we have signatures of approval, and it's all consolidated in one place. What about the results of an investigation? Who's handling that? And we've talked about how to do an investigation on the show. And I know that I challenged each of you to say, look, if you're, as the HR person, not going to head up that investigation, who's controlling the paperwork? Who's controlling the documentation? Is someone keeping it in their office? Have you even bothered to make sure that all the people involved have put all their stuff into one place? You can put that in a personnel file, absolutely. But just make sure that if there's more than one person involved, that you're not just sticking all that investigation into one personnel file, and that it's being represented into all the individuals involved in the investigation. Recognitions is another good one. If you're getting good compliments from customers, you're getting good compliments between peers, make sure that gets in the personnel file. Training records. Training records can either go into the personnel file, or if you've listened to one of my previous shows, I highly recommend that training files be kept separate. It's non-confidential information. Some organizations, some disciplines need to verify training to provide credibility for an individual's competency, to provide evidence that this individual can do what they do, licensures, certifications. So training files can be separate, but otherwise they can be put into the personnel files. Absolutely. Absolutely. How about separation records? Are you doing a termination letter? Are you doing a termination form, a separation form? I would be taking, if you're receiving resignation letters, attach it to the termination form, but definitely keep some kind of record that accurately describes the reason for the termination. You're going to need it. You may have to argue the decision to let someone go involuntarily. And then response to claims for unemployment. Absolutely. You want a record. There is so much fraud in unemployment claims right now, all because of the pandemic. Keep track of that stuff and appeal what you need to appeal, but address those quickly. If somebody else is opening the mail, make sure they know that that is top priority, that you get that information and can address it appropriately. Garnishments. Any kind of garnishment, whether it be child support or bank levies or bankruptcies or anything like that, all that can be kept in a personnel file. But when we're talking about all this information, can you see why you don't want a lot of people seeing this information? You don't want the employees to talk about what somebody's having garnished from their paycheck. You don't want the employees talking about, even a payroll clerk. It's none of her business if somebody's filed bankruptcy. It really isn't. She's a payroll clerk. HR person, yeah. The owner of the company, maybe. There's some things they don't even need to know. But then again, What don't we want to put into a personnel file? And we've already talked about training records. They don't have to go in a personnel file. But let's go back to the investigation paperwork. Do we want that to go into personnel files? Especially if they're highly, highly sensitive. Look, if you've got a supervisor being investigated as well as an employee, I could see where that might be important. But again, you got to weigh what the information is and who's going to see it. How are you going to use it? You might, under certain circumstances, want to put that separate. I know with one of my clients, we've had a couple situations come up, and he's looked at me and said, you know what? Looks like we'll be sealing this, which is fine because I know it's sealed. He has a lock. He has a key. I have a key. But we still sealed the envelope so that if by some odd chance someone goes in there or gets in there, it's definitely not something they're going to grab right away. What about benefit information? Medical files are kept separately. So any kind of benefit information, any kind of information about a release coming back from a doctor's form, it definitely goes in there in that separate file. I-9s, that's another one. We don't want to put I-9s. That's Homeland Security. They have nothing to do with the Department of Labor that oversees most of your personnel files. So keep those separate, but keep them locked. And the rules have changed here in 2023 with the new form. So read your instructions carefully before you take electronic signatures and collect the paperwork, the I-9 page 1. Well, it is page 1, but you collect that information online through your payroll system. We still have compliance issues in regards to completing that form that cannot be done solely online. You have to follow certain guidelines. So please read those instructions carefully. And then what about privileged information like attorney-client information? Drug tests. Do we want to put drug tests in a personnel file? How about background check information? Look, if we can keep that stuff separate, let's keep it separate, especially if you've got an account with a drug collection organization, your background check organization. You should be able to keep everything on their server in your account. Do it, because who should be looking at that? Certainly no one besides HR and possibly ownership. I also get the question every so often of, well, does the employee own this information? Do they have the right to come in and get copies of it? This is where state law steps in. So look into your specific states. What does the state law say? Many states have a common acknowledgement that if the employee wants to see their information, they have the right to see information. They may have different ways of requesting that, and it may be in front of a business owner or it may have to be in front of the HR person. But don't deny access to a personnel file until you know the state laws where you reside or where the employee resides, actually. The other issue, too, is all that information belongs to the company. So in many cases, an employee can't walk in and say, well, I want a complete copy of my personnel file. Most likely, you're going to be able to deny that. But if there's any litigation going on, if a subpoena comes forward, you will have to provide a copy of that personnel file to legal counsel. And I would ship it directly to legal counsel, whoever's on the subpoena or whoever is a part of that litigation, especially if it's your general counsel. Follow their direction. If you have any kind of union contracts, you have to follow their guidelines, and whatever the understanding is in that particular contract, you have to abide by it. It's not a situation where somebody can just write a letter, and I've had this happen, where somebody's written a letter and said, well, I'm in the middle of a divorce, so my attorney needs a copy of my soon-to-be ex-husband's complete personnel file. Not going to happen. Or a law firm will say, well, we're investigating a possible claim for a workers' comp that was denied, or a workers' comp claim that we may file, so we're going to need a copy of the individual's training files. Nope. Not until I see just how serious this is going. So definitely get with your your labor law attorney. Talk to your legal counsel and ask them, hey, does this sound legit? Am I obligated or responsible for giving copies? My theory is if an employee signs a document, I offer him a copy then. You signed a new tax form. Would you like a copy? You just signed this performance appraisal. Would you like a copy? You just signed this acknowledgement for a transfer at this new rate. Would you like a copy? And if they deny it, I write on the document, copy offered and denied. That way, if they come back in 6 months and say, well, I've decided I want a copy of that performance appraisal, depending on the state, I may not have to give it to them. But I will remind them, you had the chance. And I definitely do not, under any circumstances, recommend that you not sign and date the appropriate documents before you put them into a personnel file. Make sure that you're doing your due diligence in completing all the information needed on there. Make sure you understand your retention policies in your state and what is required by organizations like the IRS for payroll records. That's extremely important. Even workers' comp in some states. I know in Ohio, if it has anything to do with hazardous materials, we have to keep those records for 30 years. So double check and see what your particular state requirements are for personnel files. And then understand that the individual who's responsible for them should be responsible for them, auditing them on a regular basis. And if need be, explaining to you why there's any deviations. If an individual doesn't sign something, they don't get a copy, and why. Personnel files sometimes come up as policies in a handbook, and I don't mind that. I really don't. Again, establishing expectations so that an employee knows when they have the right to pull something from a personnel file or observe anything in their personnel files, take pictures, get copies. There's nothing wrong with making policies on that. After all, it's your information, it's your property. But work together because it's their information too. Thanks for coming. I hope that helped. Here on the Human Resource.